Good Sikh is Chelek Chavtes, the Sikh of Re'ei Aleph, the Lunishmas of Yosef Binyamin ben Rebbe Nasha Kaltman. In Parshas Te'ei, it speaks about, amongst many other things, the fact that the Eibishter chose the Mokim of the Beis HaMikdash, HaMokim Asher Bachar Boy. The Eibishter chose this specific space on the Har HaMoriah, on the Har HaBayis, for there to be a Beis HaMikdash. And we're going to discuss the uniqueness of the fact that the Mokim, the space itself, is chosen by Hashem, how that has a impact on the halacha of the way the Beis HaMikdash was built. In Hilchis Beis HaBchira, the Rambam says as follows: HaMikdash kulei lehaya b'misher ela b'ma lehahar. The Mikdash, the Beis HaMikdash, was not on a flat ground, but it was on the incline of the mountain. It went up with the mountain. And the Rambam continues to explain the various different parts of the Beis HaMikdash and the different levels of elevation that it had. When a person would enter from the main entrance, which is on the east side of the Har HaBayis, he would walk on flat ground on the to the end of the Chel. The Chel was a space, sort of like a wall that went all the way around the Beis HaMikdash on the Har HaBayis. So when you walk in, you're walking on the Chel, which is flat. From the Chel to the Ezras Nashim, you go up 12 steps. Then you walk through the whole Ezras Nashim on flat ground. Then you would go up from the Ezras Nashim to the Azara, which began with a small part that was called Ezras Yisrael, but to get from the Ezras Nashim to the Ezras Yisrael, you would go up 15 steps. Then you would walk through the Ezras Yisrael on flat ground. Then to get to the Ezras Kerim, you would step up one step that was an amma tall. Then you would walk through the Ezras Kerim, which includes the space where the Mizbeach was. All that was flat ground. And then you would go up to the Ulam with another 12 steps, and the Ulam and the Heichal. The Heichal includes the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim, so the Ulam and the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim were all on the same level. So if you were to look at it from a diagram, there's you walk in and you walk straight, up some steps, walk straight, up some steps, walk straight, up a step, walk straight, up some steps, walk straight. Okay, so the first thing that Rebbe addresses is, why does the Rambam begin his statement with a negative statement that the Mikdash was not b'misher, and not say clearly the Mikdash was b'mayla har, the Mikdash was on an incline. Thus was the Rambam fangt on umeisif tishlila, a Mikdash kule loya b'misher ela b'mayla har, und sagt nicht nor dem chiyuv, a Mikdash kule loya b'mayla har. The fact that the Rambam begins with a shlila, the fact that the Mishkan was not b'misher, was not on flat ground, and doesn't just suffice by saying the Mikdash was not, the Mikdash was on an incline. Yeshlemer, we can explain as follows: according, the Rebbe has brought this in other sikhs as well, that the Rambam holds that the building of the Beis HaMikdash was a continuation of the Mishkan, all under the umbrella of the mitzvah v'asur Mikdash, but it's sort of a new model of the same mitzvah. It seems very clear from the way that Rambam writes in the beginning of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, where he mentions the mitzvah v'asur Mikdash. And we also see this from the way that Rambam explains which items were in the Beis HaMikdash. This is a quote from the Rambam. The following items are primary in the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Oisen by Kodesh, it needs a Kodesh. The Kodesh HaKodashim, and it needs a Kodesh HaKodashim. V'yiyah lifnei HaKodesh makom echad v'hu nikra Ulam. Before the Kodesh, there's a space called Ulam. U'shloshta nikrayin Heichal, which all three together are called Heichal. V'oisen mechitza acheres saviv leichel, rechoika memeno. And then there is a mechitza the wall around the Heichal, which is a little bit further out from it. Similar to the curtains of the Chatzar Shahaya B'Midbar, which were in the Midbar, which were a little bit further out, which means to say it wasn't directly around the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but there was space between the walls of the Kodesh and the Kalei HaChatzar. So we see, number one, the similarity between this mechitza and the Kalei HaChatzar. And then whatever was inside of this mechitza is called azara, similar to the chatzar of the Oyel Moed. So again, the Rambam is comparing the base Hamikdash with the Mishkan. So we see that even though it looks a little bit different, but the concept is the same. Was Pashtus Lashene is moving as the Dvarim was in Iker Binyan Abayis, and it came over them as the Mishkan. That those spaces that were primary in the Beis Hamikdash are similar to the way they were in the Mishkan, because one is a continuation of the other. Well, that is another example. So the Rambam says that just like in the Midbar, there were three machanes: Machane Kahuna, Machane Levi, Machane Yisrael. So too in Yerushalayim there was the Harabais, there was the Beis Hamikdash, the Harabais in Yerushalayim, which formed these three machnes. So again, what we're seeing is a comparison between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan. So, in other words, the Rambam holds that the Eibusher said v'asuli mikdash, and this is a permanent mitzvah. There has to always be a mikdash that is fulfilling this mitzvah. In the Midbar, this was the Mishkan. In Yerushalayim, this was the Beis Hamikdash. The Riber Volt Megeken Meinen, because they are two parts of the same series. I would think just like the entire Mishkan most probably was on one flat space, not one higher than the other, more elevated than the other. Our initial approach would be that the Beis Hamikdash should have all been on one flat space, just like the Mishkan was. Therefore, the Rambam has to clarify that the Beis Hamikdash was not on flat ground, as the Mishkan was, but rather the Beis Hamikdash was on the incline of the mountain. So in other words, the first thing that Rabbi is explaining to us is why the Rambam has to first say Lo Yair B'Misher in the negative, and the answer is because I would have thought that it is B'Misher. I would have thought that just like the Mishkan was on flat ground, so too the Beis Hamikdash is on flat ground, and therefore the Rambam has to clarify, no, it was not on flat ground. What was it? It was B'mai Lahar. It was on the incline of the mountain. In a moment that I was going to ask, why Taka? Why are they different? If the Beis Hamikdash is a Hemshech, is a continuation of the Mishkan, why Taka are they built on different levels of elevation? The Rambam is Asef and Halachas is move on. As das was the Rambam is Mataya as the Mikdash Kule Loya B'Misher Elav B'mai Lahar is not placed the far Valazez Gwen the Tzuras Abayis B'Peil. The fact that the Rambam is a sefer of halachas, which means to say is that when the Rambam tells us something, it's a halacha, and not only that, but one halacha that leads to the next halacha. The halachas are interconnected. So if the Rambam is describing how the Mishkan Beis Hamikdash was built, that it was built on the incline of the mountain, it's not just because that's how it was in actuality. Because since it was built on a mountain, which a mountain by definition is constantly going upwards. Therefore, it must be that as you build in the Beis Hamikdash, you have to go higher and higher. You can't be on the same ground. That is not the pshat. In other words, the fact that the way that Rambam writes it implies that it wasn't just built that way because that's how you have to build something that's on a mountain. No, das is an Indian in Shalach and Mikdash Kulei. Rather, the way that Rambam writes it, because the Rambam is a sefer of halachas, it was actually a matter of halacha affecting the entire Beis Hamikdash. And in both aspects, the Mikdash Kuli Aleph Dav Zayin Nit B'Misher Lo Yair B'Misher. On the one hand, the Mikdash cannot be on flat ground. On Ela Beis Dav by Lahar, the Mikdash has to be on the incline has to be built on an incline. Has to be, in other words, has to be constantly going upwards. In other words, the Rebbe is clarifying here that this is not the Rambam is not just describing how it was actually built. The Rambam is describing the halacha of how it is required to be built. that it's not allowed to be built on flat ground, and it is required to be on an incline. When them was the Rambam is medayik zog of lashon loy ella unita mikdash kuli loy b'mayla har ella b'lev misher. From the way that Rambam writes, it was not in this way, rather it was in this way. Instead of not just saying how it was, is mashma das is nit an inyan nor lechatchila. Not at nay likuva. The way that Rambam says the loy ella, it was not built like this, rather it was built like this, implies us that it's a necessary requirement that disqualifies the Beis Hamikdash if it's not done this way. So in other words, the Rebbe is establishing here that when the Rambam describes the Beis Hamikdash being built on the Ma'ila Hahar, on the incline of the mountain, this is the halacha that it must be this way, and it is a disqualifying requirement if it's not done this way. And therefore we have to understand. Since the Beis Hamikdash is part of the mitzvah, so the Mikdash which began with the Mishkan, and we said before that those things that are of greater importance in the Beis Hamikdash resemble the way it was in the Mishkan. Versus the Asbarevas and Dominion. After Mikdash and Anitz from the Mishkan. What's the explanation that in this detail, the detail of the elevation or the height of the Mikdash, it's different than the Mishkan. That the Mishkan was b'misher, it was on flat ground, and the Mikdash was on an incline. And even though the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan were different in many details, so why are we stopping to ask about this detail specifically? Starting with the size of the Beis Hamikdash, which was much bigger, much taller, etc., than the Mishkan, plus many details in the way that it was built. For example, it was built out of stone, not built out of wood, which will be discussed later in the Sikha. So why are we stopping to ask specifically about this detail? So the Rebbe makes 3 points. You're right. Whenever there's a difference between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan, we have to understand why. In other words, the go-to approach is that the Mikdash has to resemble the Mishkan. When we change, we have to know why. So if there's a difference in the height of the Mishkan versus the Mikdash, we want to understand why. Beis bekamam is the tam poshet. Kamei the Mikdash is given ich me avanim kiyetz beze. Asach gresser on hecher me Mishkan v'chulu. While there is given ledatus in zelbanot v'kiyetz beze. In some cases, it's obvious. For example, the fact that it was made out of stone and not out of wood, the fact that it was bigger and taller, these are obvious because since it's permanent, when it's a mobile Mishkan, you want to make it smaller and something that's easy to dismantle and erect constantly. But if something is being built permanently, you could build it out of heavier material, more permanent material. You could make it bigger because it's going to stay in the same place for a long time. It still doesn't explain why the Mishkan was b'mishair and the Mikdash was b'mayla har. The third point that Rebbe makes is da dafke is ben madgish. Here, not only are we saying to do it differently, we're emphasizing that it was different than the Mishkan, and therefore we ask the question why. In other words, in certain cases we might say do it like this. Okay, I'll accept. Even though in the point Aleph, the Rebbe says that we should explain it. But besides for that, it's not like we were emphasizing the difference. Here, the Rambam is emphasizing the difference. So the question is, in that case, why? Why is there taka a difference? So in the first seif, the Rebbe established why the Rambam starts with Lo Haya b'misher, because since seemingly there should be a similarity between the Mishkan and the Mikdash, and the Mishkan was b'misher, I have to make sure to know that the Mikdash was not b'misher, was not on flat ground. In Sif Beis, the Rebbe says that clearly this is not just a description, but it is actually a halacha of how it must be done. And the question is why? Why is there a difference between the Mikdash and the Mishkan, that the Mishkan was built on flat ground and the Mikdash was built on an incline? And the Rebbe is going to explain the biur. In the next two oisiyos, next two paragraphs, the Rebbe will give the explanation in a nutshell, and then the Rebbe will elaborate on the explanation. The first point that Rebbe makes is as follows: the chilukim mekaymis was ana given b'mikdash b'mayla har Was der Hiluch von ein Chelik zum zweiten ist gewähnt bei Eifen shel Aliyah b'mailis. The fact that there were different sections of the Beis Hamikdash that continuously were more and more elevated, and from each one to the next, you had to go up steps to go higher to the next space. Seine Behesem der Mitvas Yederer von Zehot and Zich at Tesefes and Aliyah B'Kedusha L'Gabe D'Makim Farim is consistent with the fact that each space was actually more holy than the space before it, which is why you had to go higher in physical space. And the Rambam explains the various different levels of holiness. The Ezras Yisrael was holier than the Ezras Nashim. The Ezras Koyanim was holier than the Ezras Yisrael. The Heicha was holier than the Ezras Koyanim. So therefore, every time you go up to a higher a higher spiritual holiness, you're actually going up to a higher physical elevation. So based on that, this din that the mikdash was built on an incline is verbunden mit die Aliyas hadarges mikdash mikdash is consistent with the higher levels of holiness in the Beis Hamikdash. Jeder Chelek Hamikdash was a hecher in Shetach Mekemi hat hecher kedusha. Every section of the Beis Hamikdash that is on a higher physical elevation is because it contains or consists of a higher holiness. So that's point number one. The Beis Hamikdash, it wasn't all one level of holiness. It was as you went through it, every section became holier and holier, and therefore every section was higher and higher physically. And that's why only the Beis Hamikdash is on an incline. Because this concept that the different levels of holiness affect the physical elevation is is unique to the holiness of the Beis Hamikdash over the holiness of the Mishkan, and therefore specifically in the Beis Hamikdash, the spaces become continuously physically higher physically. And the Rebbe will explain this, but the point is that the fact that in the Beis Hamikdash there's a difference in elevation level because of the difference in holiness that is unique to the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan, this would not apply. Why not? In other words, also the Mishkan, the Kodesh, Hakadashim is holier than the Kodesh, which is holier than the Chatzar. So why not? Why this idea that there's different levels of holiness applies in both Mishkan and Mikdash? So why is it that the different levels of holiness would affect the physical elevation only in the Mikdash and not in the Mishkan? So here the Rebbe explains the Asbari in them. It says, between the Mishkan there's a fundamental difference between the Beis Hamikdash and between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. As follows: the Mishkan is going to be in Arai. The Mishkan was a temporary structure. The pasuk says, "I could travel, I could go with the oil and the Mishkan," meaning to say it was not something that was in one permanent space. As the Mishkan as the Rambam says that the Mishkan the Moshe built was a temporary Mishkan. Shenkin the Beis Hamikdash is going to do this keva, whereas Beis Hamikdash was a permanent dwelling. Losh the Rambam says, once the Beis Hamikdash was built, all other spaces became prohibited to be used either to build a bayis, a home for Hashem, or to bring a carbon there. There's no other building that is for the generations to come, other than the one that was in Yerushalayim on the Har HaMoriah, which is the Beis Hamikdash. So we see from the Rambam that the Mishkan was a temporary structure, the Beis Hamikdash was a permanent structure. Und der Unterschied zwischen See und Geder HaKdusha is, so what's the relevance of this in the parameters of its holiness? In Mishkan is the Chaleis HaKdusha gven beikir in the Binyan Mechalakav. In the Mishkan, the holiness of it was applied to the building and the parts of the building. The Krashim v'Yiriyos, for example, the panels for the walls, or the Yiriyos, the rugs, the carpets that served as the ceiling, the roof, which were anointed with the oil of anointment, and which were permanent, which means they were carried over into the Beis Hamikdash. In Zeis nit given kein shinui, and there was nothing changed. So therefore, they became holy, and they retained their holiness, but they are only the parts of the building. That's not the floor or the space where the Mishkan was built. In Beis Hamikdash, aber is ekven kedushas makom. In the Beis Hamikdash, there was also the kedusha of the makom, of the holiness of the space. The etzem makom hamikdash is niskadosh geworden. The very mikdash itself became holy. Und in zwei Sachen, and in two aspects. In other words, there's two places where we see that the space, the actual physical space where the mikdash was holy. Aleph davke b'regel Beis Hamikdash takol parshasenu hamokoyim asher yivchar Hashem Elokechem boi. It's in our parsha. The pasuk says the mokoyim, the space that Hashem chose. So we see that there's a bchira. We call the Beis Hamikdash Beis HaBchira, the house that was chosen. What was chosen? The mokoyim was chosen. The very space where the Beis Hamikdash was built was chosen. Base is given the Maisa Akidish on Karka Rizpa Hamikdash. We find that the floor of the Beis Hamikdash was also sanctified. The Rambam says that in the Beis Hamikdash, the floor that was laid out with stone. At Kedekach, that if a stone got loose, a kohen could not do the avodah on that loose stone. And the Gemara brings, or Rashi brings from the Gemara, that there was a process done by David HaMelech that sanctified the ritzpah, the actual floor. They had to bring 2 carbon toides, they had to sing a shir, Yeshev B'Seiser. There was a process that was done to be mekadosh the ritzpah. So we see the floor. So we see that the floor of the Beis Hamikdash was holy. Now, the Rebbe points out, with regards to the fact that we just said that the floor of the Mishkan was not holy, so the Rebbe points out, sort of parenthetically, when again the Mishkan state in pasuk ba'aseitum and ha'afar shayiyah bekarka Mishkan yikach hakayin. Even though with regards to the seita, we say we have to make this mixture that the seita is going to drink. You take the earth from the floor of the Mishkan, implying seemingly that there is holiness to the floor. He says, not ara the fisha. First of all, it was temporary. It was only while the Mishkan was there. Even while there, it wasn't because the floor was inherently holy. It's because the rest of the Mishkan was on this karka, that this karka was able to be used for the soita, for the water of the soita. But it doesn't mean that the karka itself, the floor of itself, was holy. So now that we've established that in the Mishkan, the prior, by the way, I said before that the Krashim, the Yerias were carried over into the Beis Hamikdash. I don't know if that's true. I believe when it says kavua is that the holiness was forever. I don't know that these things were actually used in the Beis Hamikdash. Just correcting myself. But going back to the Sikha. So now that we've established that in the Mishkan, the parts of the building are the holy parts, whereas in the Beis Hamikdash, the Karka and the Mokim HaMishkan are holy. And therefore there's a difference in halacha between the space where the Mishkan was and the space where the Beis Hamikdash was. By the Mishkan, once they dismantled the Mishkan and moved on from that space, no holiness remained in the original space where the Mishkan was. And it's similar to the Har Sinai after Matan Torah. Once the shofar was sounded, anybody can go on the mountain. The mountain itself did not have its own holiness. It was only holy during Matan Torah, where no one was allowed to go on it. Is there demon that I'm a paskin that makriven akabonis kul and afal bisha ancient by his bani vechon kacha kacha mechol azara afal bisha cherev in bekefas b'mechitza. The Rambam says that you could bring karbonos even though there's no Beis Hamikdash there, and you can eat kacha kachim in the azara even though it's destroyed and there's no mechitza around it. Nevertheless, the place itself is holy. The Eibusher chose that space. The Bechidis and the Mokim, the Eber bleibt the Kedusha remains. In other words, Rabbi is pointing out that because we said earlier in this if that the kedusha was the mokim, it was inherently holy. Therefore, even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the place remains holy. You're technically allowed to bring karbanis there, and you're allowed to eat the karbanis in those in the parts of that space that you would have been allowed to eat karbanis if the Beis Hamikdash was standing. So now that we've introduced this fundamental difference between the Mishkan and the Mikdash, that the Beis Hamikdash makes the Mikdash's holiness actually affects the Makom, the physical space. Now we'll understand why the Beis Hamikdash Dafke and not the Mishkan was on an incline. Al Pisa is Muvam as Dafke in Mikdash is given the Chidish as the Mikdash Kuli Loyayib Mishal of Mailar. When the Prati Achilukim in the Aliyas Mimakim Makim, Beis Hamikdash now will understand why the Beis Hamikdash was not on an incline. It was not on a flat ground, but it was on the incline, and why there were various different spaces that continuously went higher and higher. Davke Mikdash was is da akdush b'shaychas sumakim gufa in the Beis Hamikdash specifically that its holiness affected the space. Their mokim is Hashmakim Hashivchar Hashem, the space that was chosen by Hashem. Dartin is Shayach Zagin as the Chiluki Akdusha in Mikdash Shafin Chiluki Makar Mikdash. There you could say that the different levels of holiness affect the actual physical space of the Mikdash. In Goiva Hashatach from the Mekomis, in the physical elevation of these spaces, Mitwas ein Makim is Uskitov von Zweiten Makim, where one is higher and different than the other. But if the Kedusha's Makim from Beis Hamikdash is not Kedusha Klalis, because when we say that the Beis Hamikdash is the space is holy, we don't just mean one overall layer of holiness. Gleich in the ganzen Beis Hamikdash that would be equal across the whole Beis Hamikdash. There is another Chiluki Darkes Kedusha's Makim. The Hesem to the Darkes Kedusha from the Chalki Bayis Eichel Azara. But rather the different spaces have different types of holiness based on the different things the different levels of the Beis Hamikdash. Und euch die Kedusha miyuchedes von the Makom Prati is geblieben verständig. And even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, different parts of the Makom HaMikdash had different levels of holiness. Even though the Beis Hamikdash is not built there. Wie verstandig ich von der Rambam now, which is understood from the very Rambam that we quoted before, as Eichlin Kachei Kachim B'cholo Azara, Afal Pisha Yicharei, that you can eat the Kachei Kachim in the entire Azara. There is no Azara. Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But nevertheless, the space that used to be the Azara, you could eat Kachei Kachim. Achilus Kachei Kachim was became a Azara because Kachei Kachim, when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, had to be eaten in the Azara. And therefore, even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, you could only eat it in the space that was once the Azara. That implies that if you went earlier to, let's say, to the Ezras Nashim, you could not eat Kachei Kachim there. Why? Because even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there still is a difference in the holiness of the various different spaces, and that's why they're on an incline. Because since the Mokim is affected, since the physical space is affected by the holiness of the Mikdash, therefore it actually is elevated physically as the space gets holier and holier. Mashenkin der Mishkan was nit given in b'makom, whereas the Mishkan that its holiness was not permanent in the actual space. It says nit given a makom sheivchar Hashem. The Eibusha did not choose that space for it to be holy. No, the holiness was just in the parts of the actual structure, such as the krashim, the panels, the yiriyos, the rugs, the curtains. The riber is by Mishkan nit given, nit nimshich nit given the unterschied kedushas chelki Mishkan and the makim midbar. Therefore, the Mishkan did not impact the actual space, which is given arois chanias Mishkan, where there was the temporary encampment of the Mishkan, because the makim wasn't holy. There's no need to make one makim higher than the other, because the whole makim has no holiness. Therefore, the Mishkan was on a flat plane. In Shetach HaMishkan Gufa is ein Makom v'chelek HaMishkan nitken uskitelt von a zweiten Makom. The space of the Mishkan, there was no reason to make the floor elevated in some parts over the other, because the floor itself, the Makom itself, was not affected by the holiness of the Mishkan. And this explains, we asked the question in the end of Seif Beis, why does the Rambam emphasize the difference between Mishkan and Mikdash with this regard, that the Mishkan was on flat ground and the Mikdash was on an incline? So the Rambam emphasizes this difference, although there are other differences as well. Because in this detail, that the mikdash was not on flat ground, but rather it was on the incline of the mountain. Where we see that there's different levels of elevation based on the different parts of the mikdash. This expresses a major difference and a major uniqueness from the mikdash legabi mishkan of the Beis Hamikdash over the Mishkan. That because it's the space that Hashem has chosen, the mikdash lechalakav ufkiton in mekayme, the various parts of the mikdash affected the physical space in kedushas hamakim. That it was different parts of the space had different levels of holiness, and that's why also the actual makim was elevated as you went through the mikdash. It became more and more elevated. So this really answers the question. Why is the mikdash b'mayla har? Because as you go through the mikdash, it becomes holier and holier, and therefore it also becomes physically elevated as well, to be consistent with the different levels of holiness that were in the Beis Hamikdash. But this applies only to the Beis Hamikdash, because only in the Beis Hamikdash was the makom, was the space holy, and therefore it becomes elevated as you go through the Beis Hamikdash. In Sifei, the Rebbe is going to ask, what about the Kodesh HaKadoshim? The Kodesh HaKadoshim was holier than the Kodesh, and yet the Rambam did not imply that there was any higher space in the Kodesh HaKadoshim over the Kodesh. Based on what we explained, that the different levels of elevation are connected with the different levels of holiness in the Beis Hamikdash. The higher the holiness was, that's how much higher the physical elevation of the ground was. Why weren't there steps, and truthfully many steps, to go from the Kodesh, from the space that was Kodesh to the Kodesh HaKadoshim? That space was as is defined by its name. It was holy, even comparison to the holy spaces before it. It was unique in its holiness of over all of the other parts of the Beis Hamikdash. Invited to compare the Kedusha is in the Beis HaKadoshim. As the Rambam explains in the next page, the highest level of holiness in the Beis Hamikdash was the Kedusha HaKadoshim, and therefore it cannot be entered into other than by the Kohen Gadol and on Yom Kippur, and only during the Aveda. That's how holy it is. It should have been significantly higher, also physically, if the whole explanation that we've been giving till now is that as the part of the Beis Hamikdash becomes holier, the floor of it, the ground of it is elevated, then the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that was certainly so much higher than the parts before it. Why is there no elevation, no steps going up to the Kodesh HaKadoshim from the space before it? So to explain this, we are going to explain what we said before, this concept of the Makom being holy, and therefore the Makom being elevated in a hefresh sufficient Mishkan Mikdash leighton signan von Teres Chassidus by using the vernacular of Chassidus. In other words, let's understand this idea. What does it mean that the Mishkan was the holiness only affected the parts, and the Beis Hamikdash, the holiness affected the Makom? What does that mean? And let's use the words, the approach of Chassidus. Der Mishkan, was ist gewesen, Adiras Ara Kivyachol zum Ebersten, ist gewesen gebuht von Eitzim, Kroshim, Zimeach, und Yerios, teilweise gemacht von Chai. So the Mishkan, which we said before was a temporary structure, was built primarily of wood, which made up the panels of the walls, which is Tzimeach, which is from the element of vegetation, and Yerios, which are the curtains or the rugs that were the roof of the Mishkan, were made part of them at least from Chai. In other words, as we'll see soon, there were 3 Yeriyos or 4 Yeriyos. So the bottom one was called Yeriyos HaMishkan. The next one was called Yeriyos HaOil, which were made out of goat skins. Then the next one was Eiris Elim Adamim, made out of ram skins. And the next one was Eiris Tchashim, made out of a tachash skin, which is also an animal. So and even in the Yeriyos HaMishkan, they were made of Tcheles, Argamon, Tilashani, and Sheish. Now Tcheles is blue wool, and Argamon is purple wool, and Teilah Shani is red wool. Also Tzemeach, and sorry, also Chai, it's wool. And then, but you also had, so you had Sa, and then you had Sheish Masa, which is Tzemeach. So you had in the Krashim are Tzemeach, the Yeriyas are mostly Chai. Blois their karka, a welchem wat is emlef isha, make him gven, is gven doimim offer, and just the karka of the Mishkan was doimim. So you have simich, but primarily the Mishkan was made of tzemeach and chai. Shenki the Beis Hamikdash is gven adidas kefash alakas baruch hu, whereas the Beis Hamikdash, which was a permanent structure, is given gibud dike van avanim, was primarily built from avanim. And Rebbe quotes the Rambam, which we actually learned in a Sikha a few weeks ago. There was no wood sticking out in the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash was built primarily of stone and brick. Daimim. Which is lower. In other words, the Mishkan, which was a more temporary structure, is being built with more spiritual materials. And the Beis Hamikdash, which was the permanent structure, is being built with a lower level of material. Which is Mavur de Tambazeh. In Yonei Shel Mishkan is given Nit Azefel of Tzupeos and Ashini Kivu and Gas Misaelam. So Chassidus explains why is that? Because the purpose of the Mishkan was not to change the physicality of the world. The Mishkan was primarily a reflection of the way godliness is drawn down into this world, from above to below. And therefore the building of the Mishkan was consistent with the process of how the godliness comes down into this world. The Mishkan is going for Chai. The highest level, which is the roof of the Mishkan, is being made out of Chai, out of living things, animals. And the Yeriyos that were beneath that were also made primarily of Chai. Beneath that were the minority of the Yeriyos of the coverings, and then the wooden panels. That was from the next level down. So in other words, if you're generalizing it, the roof was from Chai, the walls were from Tzemeach, and then the brackets or the braces on the bottom and the actual floor, which were made out of silver and earth, respectively, doimim. So you basically have the Mishkan being built in the order of from above to below, Chai, Tzemeach, doimim. The Yisrael and Uftu from Beis Hamikdash. Now, what is greater and more unique in the Beis Hamikdash, the Kabbalah Mishkan, is in them was durch im führt sich aus die Kavana von es Avakas Baruch Hu Lisle did betachtenim davke, the fact that the purpose of the Mishkan was to fulfill the desire of Hashem that this world should be a dwelling place for Hashem in this world. That as the Kedusha, the Ashras Shechina soll nimmt sich werden durchnehmen die Welt, that this holiness of the Eibishter Shechina should actually permeate the world, bis zu the niedrigste Darge von Gas Misaelam, down to the lowest plane of this world, echt dem Suk von Daimim, even the element of Daimim, which is silent or inanimate. In welchen es setzt sich nicht begolit and Chais and Ruchnis, you don't see any life in it. Say, for example, an animal, you could see that it walks around, you could see that it's alive. Even a Tzemeach, something that's growing in the ground, you could see that it grows. There is some sign of life. A daimim has no sign of life. You can't see the spirituality of it. Even in that layer, in that level, to be able to see, to be able to infuse it with the holiness and the spirituality of Shekhinah. That's the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash. Wie bald as the Beis Hamikdash is in Yonit Mamshech and Hashras Shechina in Welt beheven as the Kedusha soll durchnehmen in Meiles and the Gashmis, and since its purpose is to permeate the physicality and to elevate the physicality, therefore it actually reflected that in the physical space of this world. As the ort where the Beis Hamikdash is gestanden is given bahar, that the space where the Beis Hamikdash was on a mountain, higher than all of the spaces around it. So the very fact that it was on a mountain represented the fact that on the one hand it's being built into the ground. The ground itself is becoming holy, but it is still higher than everything else around it because it's elevating the ground, it's elevating the physicality of it. And like we explained earlier, was hecher the aliyah when madreges akdusha b'mikdash, and as the holiness went higher and higher spiritually in the actual Beis Hamikdash, als hecher begasmi sich in the makam gashmi. Also, the physical space, the physical elevation went higher and higher. In other words, because the whole purpose of the Mishkan, previously in Sif Gimel, we used the expression that the Mokim was chosen by Hashem, and therefore the Mokim was able to be elevated because it was chosen by Hashem to become holy. Here the Rebbe is taking it a step further by using the Asis of Chassidus, that because the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash was to elevate the physical ground, the physical space, therefore the physical height of it, the physical elevation changes. Generally speaking, it was on a mountain, not on the ground level, and within that itself, it continuously goes higher and higher as the holiness becomes holier and holier. Whereas the Mishkan, which its purpose was not about permeating the physicality of the world and lifting up the lowest level. So therefore, when the Shechina rested within the Mishkan and brought holiness into the Mishkan, it did not permeate the physicality of it. It remained as an independent existence. It didn't express itself in the physical space. And therefore, even though the Mishkan had levels of holiness, the Kodesh HaKadoshim is holier than the Kodesh, and the Kodesh is holier than the Chatzar. That's true even in the Mishkan. But the physical elevation of it, Kule Misha, was all on the same level. It wasn't elevated according to the level of holiness. It was it was flat. It was on the same level as the actual midbar, because since the physicality wasn't of the world wasn't affected by the holiness of the mikdash, of the mishkan, like it was on the mikdash, therefore the actual elevation of it is not, or the actual floor of it doesn't become elevated based on the holiness of the mishkan. So this is another way of using the same Asius, that the Beis HaMikdash, because its purpose was to permeate the physical space, therefore the physical space is actually higher and higher and higher as the holiness gets more and more holy. Whereas the Mishkan, it was not about the physical space. In other words, the Rebbe doesn't use these Asis in the Sikha, but use the idea Milmaila Lamata Lamata Lamaila. The Mishkan was Milmaila Lamata, and therefore the Mata itself was not affected, and therefore there's no different levels in the floor of the Mishkan. Whereas the Beis HaMikdash represents the Milmata Lamaila. You're bringing the Mata with you, and therefore, as you get holier and holier, the Mata becomes elevated. If you remember, the Rebbe introduced this idea to answer the question why the Kodesh HaKadoshim is not higher than the spaces before it. If in the Beis HaMikdash the elevation was consistent with the different levels of holiness in the Beis HaMikdash, in Sivav, based on this vart of Sif Hey, that the whole reason why the elevation the elevations were different in the Beis HaMikdash was because the idea of the Beis HaMikdash is to lift up the Mata with it. We'll understand why the Kodesh HaKadoshim is not included in that process. Al Pi says, "Ich move in the time of us the Kodesh HaKadoshim of Mikdash, der Makom HaMekudesh BeYeser is nit given uiskitel the Goyvi from the Meichel HaMikdash." Well, now we'll understand why the Kodesh HaKadoshim was not any higher. The Indian of Azik Dusha Ruchnius from the Mikdash Peilt in the Aliyah from Gasmis Makim. This idea that the spiritual holiness affects the physical elevation, which is why one space is higher than the next. This only works when the higher level of holiness is relative to the holiness that came before it. You can measure it by the steps. You could say this is 12 steps higher than the space before it, and therefore there's 12 physical steps to go up from one to the next. Wenn es redt sich aber wegen Azam der Regen Kedusha, was ist Hecher bei einer Reich, bis wir sagen Hecher von dem Together von Milo Mata. But if you're talking about a level of holiness that totally transcends the previous level, you can't even be defined by higher and lower. But Darganailis bei einer Reich, it is totally incomparably higher. Is the Chelek does a good in that salt trap. Miles in Geva Mother do Mugbu. You can't measure it by steps. You can't say, okay, this is this many steps higher than the next. Nitten Geva Makam Gashmi. It cannot be measured by physical space. As if to say, 1 second, okay. Und das ist der Chelek zwischen Shar Chelek und Mikdash HaKadoshim. And that's why there's a difference between the rest of the Mikdash and the Chelek HaKadoshim. Chelek HaMikdash is the Kedusha von einem Hecher aber be'erach. Hot and erech zu dem Chelek when there Kedusha smucha. In the other parts of the Beis HaMikdash, the holiness was relative. It was holier, but relative to the space before it. Umasam the Chiluk erech is there Chiluk in Misper and Geva Miles b'Makom l'Makom, and consistent with the difference in the holiness, in the relative holiness, is how many steps there were. And then is also physically one was higher than the next. Aber bei der Kedusha von Kedesh HaKadoshim was dort given Gili Ba'amakim von Atzmos. When you noise, but when you talk of the holiness of the Kedesh HaKadoshim, when there was there the revelation of the essence of Hashem, which is Nim Nahanim noise, which means that literally means the impossible is impossible, which is something that is intellectual, incongruous, which means to say that it doesn't make any sense logically because it is higher than making any sense. Like we know that you could not measure the physical space. The Arin, as it was measured, was not measured into the space, which does not make sense logically, and that is because this space was higher than space. You're talking about a fusion of holiness and physicality as it becomes fused together in a way that totally transcends human logic. Which is therefore it's totally incomparable in holiness to the previous sections. It is higher than the whole concept of a higher and lower. You can't measure that even in the smallest way possible in physical height. Which is so finite. As if to say, I was going to say this in the paragraph before, how many steps? How many steps are you going to make from the Kedesh to the Kedesh HaKadoshim? 12, 15, 100. When there is a relative holiness, then you could make steps, you could measure it. This is this much more holy than that. But when you're talking about the Kedesh HaKadoshim, there's no way to compare one to the next. There's no way to measure one to the next. And therefore you can't make steps. You can't say this is higher than this, because it's beyond being higher. And therefore physically, there was no way to make it higher. Nachan inyan in them. And to say this to explain the higher, the holiness of the Kedesh HaKadoshim, in other words, by focusing on a specific nuance in the Rambam. When a person enters from the eastern gate, he walks, he goes until the end of the Chel. And then he ascends from the Chel to the Aznashim, 12 steps. Then he has to go. Then he has to ascend again. As by the Milas Valiyas Reta Nita Zevik and gave him Makam Datsme. The way that Rambam talks about it is not so much about the fact that it was higher, but the fact that the person is going and ascending himself as he goes through it. Is the mitber Ramis, as the Alim Adregis and Kedusha, as the mentions Hoilich, with Darga Darga, there's Beifan Shaloila, as Muspayos and Aliyah Bahadam, and Darv Zichul Feben and Elis Amit Darga Darga. So we can explain this, that the Rambam is alluding to the fact that the person has to elevate himself. It's not just that the physical space was higher and higher, but the idea of going higher is that the person that is there has to go higher and higher as he traverses through the Beis HaMikdash. When you come to the Kedesh HaKadoshim, it's not in a way that the person could elevate himself. That he's ascending higher and higher, he's climbing higher and higher in his levels of holiness. When a person comes to Kedesh HaKadoshim, there's no way to measure levels. The person is on a flat ground, so to speak. The person enters into a state of total bittul. So until the Kedesh HaKadoshim, the person is ascending, is going higher and higher in his own spiritual journey. The Kedesh HaKadoshim is where the person reaches a level of total bittul. So therefore there's no way to, and here there's an extra vot. Now there's not only is there no way to measure steps, you dafka have to not have steps because it's a space of bittul. And this explains why the Kodesh HaKadoshim did not have any steps going up to it, because the Kodesh HaKadoshim is beyond being described as higher. It can't be, it's higher than Milo Mata, and there's no way to measure the height of it, and therefore there's no way to put steps. Additionally, this is a place of bittul, and therefore it has to be on the most basic level. Obviously, it's not going to go lower than the space before it, but it's going to stay on the same level as the space before it. Das ist verbunden mit dem Beis Hamikdash, welches verschachanti beseicham mit der Beginne von Kodesh HaKadoshim, was is in the Mikdash Haprati for Yid Yidden, and this relates to the Beis Hamikdash that's within every single Yid. That within every single Yid there is a Kodesh HaKadoshim, a holy of holies, which is Pnimius, the Pnimius Alev, the deepest most part of the person's heart, which is also referred to as the level of Yechida. Was in Im is the talking Sir Va'agbala, which on that level there's no way to describe it or to define it. And certainly there's no a physical space. It's like a nucleus, like a dot that is not yet opened up into physical space. Which is why this part of the person is alluded to in the tip of the yud, before the yud even became a letter. The yud itself is a dot. And in the yud itself, there's a tip of the yud, which represents that it's still a dot. In other words, you have yud kei vav kei, so you have 5 levels of the neshama. So yud kei vav kei are the 4 lower levels of the neshama. The yechidah shebenefesh is represented in the dot that's on top of the yud. That is a nucleus that has not yet been opened up to take space. On that level, the Yid sets aside his entire existence, and his entire desire is to connect and to be in a state of bittul to the Eibishter. And this is where the deepest, most bond between the Yid and the Eibishter, which is beyond, which transcends description, it transcends explanation. Yechida liyachtach, which is the level of yechida that connects with the essence of Hashem. B'dugmas k'tisas king gadol al tzashliach v'kol amcha beis Yisrael b'chol makom sheim achas b'shanu l'kedesh kedoshim, which is what took place when the Kohen Gadol, as a representative of Klal Yisrael, entered into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, this once a year. So it was one person once a year in one specific space in the entire world, which is where it was so holy and so beyond that it connected Klal Yisrael, the highest level of Klal Yisrael, with the most essential, with the most essence level of Hashem in that very specific moment. So, in other words, that this idea of Kodesh Kodashim exists within every single Yid, that every single Yid could reach this level, or has his core is the level of Yechida, which is where you can't define it by holier and accomplishments and define it. It's the essence. It's the core level of a Yid that is higher than anything. It is infinite.